Hi, and welcome back. Now, if you are just joining us, I am William Allen, streaming to you live from my living room in California. And this first ever virtual 99U conference is an exploration of the creative self. We've been exploring that theme all day with talks and workshops shot across the globe. I hope you've enjoyed them, and a special thanks to my colleagues, Jeannie Huang and Jinjin Sun, for leading those workshops. I thought they were just fantastic. I hope you enjoyed them as well. Now, all of this year's talks and explorations are available on demand. So if you missed a talk earlier or you want to design your own agenda, head to behance.net/99U anytime to dig in. Now, this session explores not just our creative selves, but how we bring ourselves into our workplaces and our communities. What's our power and our purpose within them? Our first speaker this afternoon is the founder and CEO of Sylvain Labs, a strategy and design consultancy that is a certified B Corporation. Let's hear from Alain Sylvain.
Hi, my name is Alain Sylvain. You're about to watch a presentation I gave on May 22nd entitled Power Languages. And it was about how do we unlock our internal creative potential for power and our relationship to power, which is a little eerie and prophetic in this moment we're in. It was shot a couple days before the death of George Floyd, which of course sparked a social moment, a social crisis. And frankly, it was a social crisis and moment that we've been in for generations. But for me, as you watch this presentation, I would urge you to do three things. One is learn, what does power mean to you and what is your relationship to power? Two is act. How do you take this kind of passive watching presentation experience and do something about your perception of power and what power means to you? And three, and maybe more importantly, is commit. How can you make this learning about power endure and really have some longevity for you and the greater society that we all live in? So this is the context for this talk, and I hope it resonates. Thanks. Hello, Internet. My name is Alain Sylvain. I'm the founder and CEO of Sylvain Labs, and I'm here to talk about power languages. How we all have a unique relationship to power, and when you unlock it, you're really capable of doing incredible things. By way of introduction, my company Sylvain Labs is a strategy and design consultancy headquartered in New York. We help companies think about the future of their products and brands. We're about 10 years old, a certified B Corporation, wholly independent. We work with a number of different companies in a number of different industries, helping them think about brand strategy and innovation and design. But I want to take a pause. And I want to think about creative people. I want to think about you. I want to talk about designers and what designers are capable of. Because when designers manifest their ideas, they have the power to shape and influence the world. The ideas are visceral, they're psychological, they're emotional. Creative power, you might even argue, is more important or more powerful than the creative person, him or herself. The potential of creativity is greater than the possessor of creativity. So if we take a step back and we think about what does that power mean and how can we manifest that power as creative people in order to truly maximize our potential? It starts quite simply with the definition of power, which if you reduce it to its quite simplest, it's really about being able, to be able or not to be able. That's what it means to be powerful. If you deconstruct it a little bit further, you'll see there's so many applications of the concept. We use it in so many different ways. And quite casually, actually. We use it colloquially, we use it simply, we use it culturally. There's several definitions and applications for the concept of power. But one thing we can't deny, though, is that, or maybe that's in itself is an example of the fact that power is everywhere. It's everywhere we look, especially as creative and designers. As we operate, we are in a political or power structure in every single interaction we have with clients, with our surroundings, with our work, with culture. Power is everywhere. And we use it in a number of ways. You think about the power elite, the mysterious cabal of political leaders and business leaders and celebrities that run the world. Or you think about power on a more personal level, how our own willpower is a very quiet and private capacity that we have. Power can be societal, it can be personal, it can be social. You think about man-spreading on the train, a really subtle social, micro-aggressive cue to assert some sort of power. Or you think about social media, which maybe in and of itself is nothing but an experiment in power, where you're amassing followers, asserting influence on others. It's nothing but a machine of power that you're entering. We use the term power everywhere. We use it in professional sports. You think about the power forward, which is really a symbolic and important player on the field, or on the court. You think about the power play in hockey, which is an incredibly powerful moment. We use the term power when we think about superpowers. Is China an emerging superpower is a question that's often asked. We use it when we talk about superpowers in this context, when we're talking about fantasy or science fiction. The word power interweaves itself in everything we do, certainly culture. I mean, if you think about hip hop, and I'm a huge hip hop fan, hip hop in and of itself is nothing but an experiment of power. It's about people on the margins of society asserting some control over their own life and their future, telling stories in new and different ways, which ultimately amasses a sense of political and social power, social currency. So what does the concept of power mean for the designer or the creative? What does power mean in our everyday interactions? How can we relate to power in a way that arms us with capacity and our own capabilities? Let's take a step back. Let's look at history. Let's look at science. Let's really get nerdy. Let's deconstruct this concept of power and really not be so turned off or scared of what that could mean. Because the term itself could be quite intangible. It can be quite abstract. And on one hand, it could be dynamic. You could be powerful in one situation and then lose that power quite quickly. If you look at history or geopolitical history, there's a great example in Rand McNally's Histomap, which really shows over centuries how political dynasties and regimes shifted and how power shifted over hundreds and hundreds of years. Power is dynamic. It's constantly shifting. One person could be powerful in one dynamic and quickly lose it in the next. Winston Churchill, the famed and legendary UK Prime Minister, asserted incredible power during World War II, but famously lost in the general election to the Labour Party. And it wasn't until 6 years later did he regain the premiership. Power is dynamic, based on time. Power is also relative. One person could be powerful only relative to someone else. You're only powerful relative to someone else, not in and of itself. Power is entirely a relative dynamic. We often look at CEOs of public companies and think, well, this person is incredibly powerful. This person wields incredible power, when in reality, those people are actually in service of a board of directors who you might argue are really the leaders or the powerful people. This concept of power being relative plays out in business every day, but it also plays out in nature and in science. The Apomis beetle is a great example of this. Amphibians obviously eat insects to survive, but the Apomis beetle is the one insect that will kill any amphibian that tries to eat it. An amphibian, a frog, takes a bite and it dies every single time. And the Apomis survives. Who's the predator and who's the prey? Who's powerful and who's not? Or you think about this forum right here, where I'm talking to you. Yes, I'm communicating my ideas. Does that make me powerful? But you are interpreting my ideas and judging them. Does that make me powerless? Power is relative and constantly changing. Power is situational, depending on where you sit and what's the context of where you are. Power is situational. We saw that in Vietnam as a great example. The American military might was contingent on conventional weaponry and conventional war tactics, when the Viet Cong relied on more guerrilla warfare, things like booby traps and relying on jungle cover. That armed the Vietnamese with an unprecedented power that the US was not capable to deal with. In some contexts, learning disabilities are viewed as powerless, dynamics, that if you are autistic or dyslexic, that you are inherently powerless. But in certain situations, we've actually seen how those learning disabilities can be advantages and could arm someone with a new sense of power. We hear these stories all the time. Certainly the story of IKEA and the founder, he was famously dyslexic, and something about his dyslexia, something about how he interacted with language and with design and symbology allowed him to create what we know of today as IKEA. So power is actually situational too. Ultimately, power shapes every single human interaction. It's everywhere. It's part of our natural human experience. We're born with it. We're used to it. Even starting as children, we learn about it. We learn about it in our interactions with our family. We learn all about it through Dr. Seuss. We learn about it everywhere. That this idea of autonomy and control is important. It's part of the human condition to really understand and behave within that construct. I believe designers, creatives, there are few people that face power dynamics more. Where at first you're endowed with a craft to create ideas and bring things to life that no one else can. It took years to master. It took an inherent capacity for invention and fantasy and imagination that makes someone creative. But at the same time, in order to truly leverage it in this industry, in this economy, you have to sell it to other people that might be more powerful, clients, let's call them clients, or stakeholders who judge and oftentimes might think of themselves as more powerful than you because of that sheer fact that they're paying for the work. So who's powerful? Is it the craft or is it the kind of the funder? So I believe designers have a unique relationship with power, and it's interesting to think about what that could mean. We all react to power differently. That's the thing. It's like love. Love, we all have a way of asserting, expressing love. We have a way of receiving love. Power is the same exact way, and certainly for creative designers, we have a way of asserting power and we have a way of receiving power. There was the book, The Love Languages, that really broke down how we can express and receive love. That was a beautiful, simple distillation of it. We can do it through acts of service. We can do it through physical touch. We can do it through words of affirmation, receiving gifts, quality time. In the same way, I argue that there are power languages, that there are ways that we exert control over others. There are ways that we understand control or we feel controlled. And I'll explain what I mean. So first, there's posturing. Posturing, and this could be physical and this could be more abstract. But the notion of posturing, the notion of building up symbols to suggest that one is more assertive or more powerful than another is in itself a language. There was this great TED Talk about Wonder Woman and the stance of posture. And superheroes, of course, use that stance. And by the way, political icons and celebrities use that stance to say something about how powerful they are. Or you look at the barrel-chested, Vladimir Putin on a horse. If anything, that's nothing but a posture. It's like, look, I am one with nature and I can control this beast. And those sort of posturing moments are ways that parties often assert a certain control or power. We face posturing as creative and designers all the time when we're dealing with contracts or we're dealing with reviews. Some of those formalities and those protocols are really nothing but moments of posturing. How about persuasion? Persuasion is another way to understand and deliver a sense of power. Machiavelli, of course, famously said, never attempt to win by force what can be won through deception. The power of persuasion, the power to allow people to change their behavior and think differently about who they are and where they're going, that power of persuasion is obviously a power in and of itself. Or how about power through personal attack? The idea of diminishing someone's stature in order to increase our own. There's some people I don't need to tell you about who do that quite well. We face it even in our everyday through designers and creatives, through some of those formalities, through the 5 minutes waiting on a Zoom is in a way a personal attack. So I think we face these things every day. And ultimately, all three of those things are tied to intimidation. Those asserting power are looking to intimidate, and those who are powerless often feel intimidated. We have a natural reaction of intimidation where we shrink. We shrink when we see power. And society has worked really, really hard to define what power is in culture today. We believe there's a standard. There's a standard for what power looks like in culture, and we in turn shrink to it every single time. It's part of the great cultural industrial complex. It's part of socializations. Babies are raised seeing power look like a certain thing, and they react to it. And I'll explain what I mean. Power is often viewed as masculine. We can definitely see that when it comes to the presidents in the modern era. Whether you're talking about Ronald Reagan with his axe, you're talking about George W. with hunting, or famously he was the guy you wanted to have a beer with, or you think about Obama on the court. Those were all kind of symbols of power, and that were tied to what often are perceived as masculine. Power is often also viewed as menacing, scary, mysterious, that we don't know what's possible when something powerful comes our way, that it's ruthless and unfettered. Power also plays out in normal social interactions, in the sense that we believe subconsciously and through socialization often that white men are more powerful than anybody else. And it plays out in culture. We see it in Hollywood. 70% of all speaking roles in Hollywood are spoken by white men. You go to Washington, D.C., you look at all the monuments in Washington, D.C., they're all white men. You look at the boards of the greatest companies and organizations or political leaders, white men. It's part of an education that people have had, where it really begins to seep into your subconscious. Power is often also tied to wealth. You think about the Rockefellers, or you think about the Kennedys or the Bushes. There's a direct connection between the wealth and political power. Power also favors good-looking people, attractive people. Like, we often defer to attractive people because we think they are more powerful. You could look at celebrities, you could look at prime ministers around the world. So how do we unleash our own potential? Now that we understand power in a greater kind of macro cultural way, how do we truly use this learning to help us in our creative work and in the work of design? How can we understand our language, our own power languages, flip it? How can we flip it? How can we take our power languages and use them more as tools to help us get to where we want to go? And I'll give you a few examples. So the first is, remember I said power is dynamic, that it can change over time, that one person could be powerful one moment and then maybe a moment or two later they're no longer powerful. Thomas Edison is such a great example of someone that really challenged this notion. He was prolific. He was incredibly productive. He produced and drafted thousands and thousands of patents. Actually, it wasn't until 2003 that he held the record for the most patents held. He created companies. He founded universities. He was an incredibly productive and enterprising human being. He was unfettered and relentless when it comes to productivity. His ambition was incredible. And it was through that ambition that he was able to weather the dynamism of the world of power. Or Sir James Dyson, who it took him over 5,000 patents to eventually discover the vacuumless vacuum that we all know as Dyson. It was 5,000 times. It only took one time to be right. That ruthless ambition, that ability to stick with it for that long, that drive, that's how we truly face and deal with a world where power is so dynamic. Power is relative. Remember I said that? So power is relative. Power is really depends on who you are empowering over or who you are empowered by. And so a great example of this is Greta Thunberg, who famously alerted the world further about climate change and the climate crisis. And what's interesting about Greta Thunberg is it's not so much what she was saying, it's not so much the anger with which she was saying it, but she had a currency that everyone else talking about this topic didn't have. She uncovered a new currency, and that was the fact that she was young. It was her youth that was a currency in itself that armed her with an authoritative voice when it comes to the climate crisis. People listen to her because she's young, and some might even argue because she's a young woman. It makes her unique, and it makes her powerful. So how can we, as creative people, uncover a new currency for us that give us a new opportunity to assert power? Power is also situational. So remember, I said that it depends on the context and where you are. But if you embrace the rebel within, if you embrace that there's a rebellious instinct within all of us, all the time, you can achieve a sense of power. Because remember, power requires a certain sense of passivity. You know, Prince is such a great example of this, and I will never miss an opportunity to talk about Prince. Frustrated with his label and with the record industry, he famously said, if you don't own your masters own you. He, over the last 20 or 30 years of his career, every move he made was a challenge to the record industry and that entire marketing complex to assert some creative control in what he was making and who he was. He famously, he sold the first album online. He changed his name to a kind of undecipherable symbol. Those were all famous examples and acts of rebellion. So embracing the rebel within is important. So if power is dynamic, power is relative, and power is situational, I argue that we should employ relentless drive like Thomas Edison. Never stop, be ambitious, create, be prolific, be productive in the face of changing times. I argue that we should activate new currency. We should find new things within us that make us different and create a new voice for who we can be. Greta Thunberg did that by virtue of the very fact that she was young. Or we embrace the rebel within. We find new opportunities to challenge the status quo. And don't stop challenging that. And I think through a combination of relentless drive, new currency, and rebellion, we can really unlock the potential of our own power language. Thank you for listening. My name is Alain, founder and CEO of Sylvain Labs. See you next time.
The Dots, Deconstructing Influence, is available in the 99U virtual bookstore. Just scroll down, you can find it there. Now, our next speaker is a prolific design leader, the founder of Creative Reaction Lab and AIGA's Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, and also a member of Adobe's Design Circle, among her many positions, fellowships, and accolades. Please welcome Antionette D. Carroll.
Hello, 99U community, as well as Behance community. I'm really excited to speak with you today about the future of design leadership, as well as the roles of identity, power, and equity in this work. My name is Antionette Carroll, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am more known for being the president and CEO of Creative Reaction Lab, but I also run another organization called Design Plus Diversity LLC. I am a social entrepreneur, but the most important title for me is being a designer. And I'll explain a little later why I really harp on this title. Yes, I was technically trained as a graphic designer. I worked in the field for almost 10 years as a practicing designer, but the way that I use design now is not the traditional way in which we talk about it in the visual communication and design space. In my career and in the last experience of starting Creative Reaction Lab and running this organization, I've had many honors and opportunities, such as being named of a fellow of too many organizations, honestly, to name, which include being a TED Fellow, being an Echoing Green Fellow, which is an organization that supports big, bold ideas and historically have supported the launch of Teach for America, City Year, and honestly, I've been honored to be a part of that community to really bring design and creative problem solving into that space. But then most recently, I was named the Anti-Defamation League and Aspen Institute Civil Society Fellowship. Within my career, I have worked historically for a while with AIGA, the Professional Association of Design. In particular, I was the founding chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Task Force, as well as a former national board director of AIGA. So a little bit about my story. When I was growing up, I had a loving family. I was raised in a household that gave me the opportunity to have my grandmother and my grandfather as my parents, honestly, my mom and my dad as my parents, and my aunt and my uncles as my parents. So you can imagine that that was stressful, as well as a benefit at occasional times when you wanted to pit them against each other to really get what you want. But also growing up in my life, I grew up in a historically underinvested community. I didn't necessarily know I was growing up in poverty. It wasn't until later that I realized that my family's mindset of striving towards a goal of $19,000 a year actually was abnormal. For me, it was actually the norm. And so I spent a lot of time in my life really trying to determine what was my worth beyond economics, which is what we usually are taught in our life, to strive for a certain career, to strive for a certain goal that usually has to do with mobility and survival, and surviving our communities. And in that journey, my first fellowship that I went through was through an organization called Starting Block. And it's an organization that supports social innovators. And I didn't necessarily know what I was going to do, but within this program, I really started to understand the power of my purpose, to understand the power of, honestly, my ability to be a designer beyond what's on the computer screen and what I'm drawing on a sheet of paper, but really thinking about how do I design better systems for not only myself and my family, but also my community, and really expanding my idea of even what community means. And so my career in design and advertising was one in which I had more of a traditional path, from being named the most promising minority student from the American Advertising Federation, through having different positions in corporations, in higher education, even in agency, and ultimately still do some traditional work. And it also has led to me being recognized by GD USA as person to watch, as well as an ad color innovator. But I realized that that work wasn't enough for me. And so I didn't want to just create something that goes out in the world and then I leave and that's it. And so I really started to reflect on what was the impact that I can make in my own design community. That was the first really community I started to think about around what's the actual impact I can have. And on this screen, you see these amazing individuals that I've had the pleasure of work with throughout the years, particularly through AIGA's Diversity Inclusion Task Force, where together we started to think about how do we increase particularly racial, but also representation around ability status, sexual orientation, gender identity, particularly in leadership roles within the traditional graphic design, visual communication industry. And these are individuals from across the country that have really started to think about how can we be more than our degree? How can we be more than what people like to pigeonhole us as, and really think about how do we shift our own system within our own communities. And from there, I started to dive deeper and deeper into my diversity inclusion work. The photos you see here are from Design Plus Diversity Conference, as well as a national fellowship that we started in partnership with Microsoft, with Google, with Adobe, and thinking about how do we increase not only more diverse representation, but also how do we collectively raise our own consciousness on how we can use our practice and our craft to address the social ills that are within our communities all across the world. Also, I have been a part of a team that really started to think about how do we actually understand what our industry looks like. For many years in our industry, we referenced a 1991 study that was looking at the fact that why the graphic design industry was 93% white. And that was the number that we tended to use when really making justifications on what we could do to change our industry. And so myself, as well as a group of members throughout AIGA, as well as Google, partnered to create the Design Census program. This program now has been going 4 years, but really looking at what is the makeup of our actual industry, what makes us happy in our industry, and what's the opportunity to actually make things better. And one of the things that we found even in the 2019 study, 3 years after its launch, was that really, according to the participants of this study, our design industry is still 71% white. As an African American and Black traditional designer as well, we only have 3% of the industry. That is hugely problematic, because when you think about the power of design and all the different industries in which we touch, we hear it through design strategy, we hear it through industrial design, urban design, even traditional graphic design. We touch so many fields, and yet if we don't represent how the community actually looks and how the community lives, are we actually designing for the larger community or for a specific community, which historically has been done in our industry. And so this led to AIGA, Creative Reaction Lab, which is the institution that I run, as well as Microsoft partnering to create the first Design for Inclusivity Summit. And we brought together designers from the corporate space, from the agency space, community designers, as well as community members to really start to think through what are different strategies that we need to integrate in our industry to not just say, oh, an organization was looking at increasing Black designers by 2%. That's not enough. We need to have a cultural and systemic shift within our actual industry. And so I'm going to show you a video of what we went through for that day and some of the things that we were discussing to really think about what's the impact we can make in our community. So at the Design for Inclusivity Summit, we saw the importance of having community and industry at the table.
When we say community, there are so many passionate, motivated, creative people creating change. And part of me just say, wow, how can we help make this even better for them?
When we have a summit like this, let's think about who that we is. If all of us are here as leaders in our current form, who are we opening doors for?
We have to collectively come together to solve this problem. No single company can do it. No single person is capable of fixing this.
The key to inclusive design is including people in the process, in the conversation, in the shared awareness of what it is.
As a disabled person working in accessibility, I had a unique power that a lot of times people would listen to me and they appreciated the insight I could give so they didn't make some basic accessibility mistakes before the research even started.
I've always been the other in the room. So I think when you talk about inclusion, you start to create spaces where others feel comfortable.
I think a lot of companies, a lot of industries are looking at diversity and inclusion as an initiative. That's something you need to work on, versus how do we be more intentional in terms of the outcome.
If I were to define what design is, it would be deliberate intent. The key to inclusive design is not only as a designer understanding your role as a communicator, but also understanding who you're speaking to on behalf of.
I think where real learning happens is when you hear about other people's experiences and you can be in a conversation with them, because then you can make connections that you'll remember for a long time.
I think one of the biggest barriers is actually just empathy. If you don't feel safe in the room to share your ideas or to share your identity, you will never get to the bigger solutions.
When I look at community and designers that do work in human-based as well as geographic community, I view individuals that are living experts in their spaces, and they are really able to think about the day-to-day impact of whatever is impeding them and impacting them.
This idea of belonging, and I want to help create that for our culture, for our place of work, but also for the whole industry. So you belong, we all belong.
Going through this experience, I started to realize that we don't have a talent pipeline issue, we have a perception issue. And we need to understand that where we are actually sourcing designers, and as people in the 99U community and as designers that have all these Behance portfolios, and when I say designers, again, I'm not just talking about traditional graphic designers. You all know that you come from many different walks of life. Some of you did not pursue a BFA. Some of you pursued a completely different degree. Some of you didn't pursue a degree at all. But yet that doesn't take away from your creative talent and the impact that you can have in the industry. But we have to also have a conversation of what does access look like in our community, and how do we make sure that we are creating a culture and a dynamic that allows us to show up as our authentic selves, and a way for us to really start to design with a larger community in mind. That then led to me working with Adobe even deeply, particularly through their Design Circle program, where they launched a scholarship really looking at how do we reach youth earlier to support them in their career and becoming practicing designers, and sending out content and thought leadership articles for the practicing designers in the field to think about what's the impact that we can make. And I've joined with over 24 individuals across the world that's really looking at what can we actually do beyond just talking about what representation looks like to actually putting our money and our time where our mouth is. But we need to understand that beyond design's makeup, we need to understand our design power. Because too many times we focus on quote unquote diversity, even though I would challenge you to really think about diversity of what identities when you're saying we need more diversity. We talk about representation so much that we don't actually hold ourselves accountable and responsible for the power that we have in our own industry. I started to really realize this in 2014. August 9th was the day that Michael Brown Jr. was killed in St. Louis, Missouri. I am a St. Louis, Missouri resident. And at this time, I was still working as a traditional designer, but I was also working at a diversity inclusion organization. And so I started to ask the question, why are we only looking to policy creators? Why are we only looking to, diversity inclusion specialists to actually look at how do we improve the systems in our community when we look to designers all the time to create something out of nothing? We navigate complexity every single day when we are creating around us, but yet many times we're not invited to the table when it comes to social justice, when it comes to human rights, when it comes to, honestly, us being able to survive as a human race. And so I was thinking through the lens of the fact that we needed to bring creative professionals, activists, as well as community members together to come up with their own interventions to address St. Louis's racial divide. This took the form of a 24-hour design challenge per se. And from that, we had over 60 ideas pitched, and 5 ideas were actually worked on throughout the night. All 5 were launched in St. Louis within a year, and up until 2 years ago, 3 were still active. So an example one that came out was Cards Against Brutality. How many people have actually heard of Cards Against Humanity? This game is nothing like that. I'm not going to judge you because I've played the game myself. I don't really talk about what happened there because I have a brand that I have to uphold, but I will say I had a great time. But one of the things about this particular project was looking at the fact that there is media narration and framing around victims of police brutality. And whether you want to acknowledge police brutality exists or not, in my community, it does. And this particular project was looking at how do we educate police officers, how do we educate, honestly, people in the education space to really start to, and the media space, to really start to think about what are the actual narratives and stories that we are hearing about people, particularly unarmed victims, that many times put blame on them opposed to recognizing them as human beings. How we've lost the fact that we are losing humans every single day and we have justifiable reasons in some people's mind around that, versus looking at the fact that these are individuals that could have lived on our street, that could be our brother, could be our neighbor. That matters. And as a human race, we've lost something. And so this project was saying, how is this someone's mother? How is this someone's brother, someone's father, someone's teammate, and understanding who they were at the human level. We also had a project called the Vibe Switch Project, which really had this very simple mindset that, as they would put it, stereotypes suck. And so they really had people think about, how have I been stereotyped? And then how do I take back my identity? And it was a very simple prompt, which saying others have stereotyped me as blank, but in reality, I am blank. And we have seen so many responses to that because many people have been stereotyped across various identities. And we have to think about when other people try to take ownership of our identity and we don't push back to really say, but I am this, are we giving them our power? And so this project was a way for people to really reflect on their own individual power. And then another project that came from this was called Connected for Justice, formerly Beyond Today. It was created by a designer named Dee Nichols. And her idea was that we need to bring people together through civic matchmaking. It was very similar to, Match.com, Cupid, Tinder. But instead of swiping for maybe your partner or a side piece, I'm not judging, it instead was having people come together around social justice projects. And this project was only intended for the original protest in 2014. When it ended in November 2014, over 700 acts had occurred because of this site. And so this experience really had me think about, what is my impact? What can I do? But my story changed on May 2nd, 2018. I was doing the work. I was really thinking about how can I, as a designer, address issues particularly around racial inequity and racial injustice. And then I received a phone call on May 2nd, 2018. So this is a picture of my brother. His name was Oscar Johnson III. And he loved basketball. He played video games like every person. I would say everyone plays video games, but I have a bias because I have kids that play Fortnite all day. But he was honestly just a really funny, genuinely just great boy. And I received a phone call on May 2nd informing me that my brother, my only little brother, had been shot. And I was told that he was shot in the arm. We rushed to the hospital, but I had to go and pick up my sibling to get to the hospital because I was the only person in the family that had flexible transportation. So I drove from my job, which was, mind you, only 10 minutes away from the hospital in which he was located, 30 minutes to get my sister, to then drive back to the hospital. And when we were in the lobby to get up to see him, we received a phone call from his twin telling us that he had died. And it was in this moment that I really started to reflect on, why am I doing this work? I started to question my impact. I started to question what it meant to actually truly be a creator, be a designer. And I even started to ask the question, if I couldn't save my brother, how can I save anyone? And so this experience really made me sit down and think, what really is important to me? There's a poem called The Bail Stand, and it talks about clearing everything out so that you can build this bail stand of greatness. And it really made me start reflecting on, what was my bail stand? And was everything I was doing in the community actually part of my purpose? And so I've cleared a lot of things out in my life to really focus on why I do what I do. I've convened in partnership with the staff at Creative Reaction Lab, because no matter what they tell you with the social entrepreneur dream, no one does this work alone. It takes a team. With my team, we convened Black and brown youth in St. Louis to come up with their own interventions around addressing gun violence in the region. With my family, we actually started a foundation in his name called the Oscar Johnson III Youth Hope Foundation around supporting Black and Latinx youth to honestly pursue their hopes and dreams. I call it pretty much a make-a-wish for Black and brown kids. Very simple. And it also made me acknowledge that all of the issues that we see in our community all are connected to public health. And the fact that violence is a major public health issue. And violence is many times connected to racism, which is another major public health issue. Because I found my family having to say in media interviews, because it was even all the way into the New York Post, that he was a good kid, that he wasn't out in the street, that, he didn't fit this certain stereotype and imagery that we have about Black kids. And so it made me realize that we gotta change our socialization. We have to change, honestly, how we think about our identities and how we view the perception of others. We have to change how we even understand our own power. And all that led to my purpose. The reality is that every system in our lives produces what it was designed to produce. And I personally believe oppression, inequality, and inequity are by design. So if they are by design, that means that they can be redesigned. And at Creative Reaction Lab, we are working with Black and Latinx youth to become leaders in designing healthy and racially equitable communities, to really think about how they can be redesigners for justice and for change in their communities. But we also recognize that working with just traditional media individuals and traditional designers was not enough. And so we do focus on 4 different sectors that we call narrative and livelihood shapers, because these sectors, whether we're talking about government and public service, we're talking about health and healthcare, education, media and technology, these sectors impact our life expectancy, quality of life, as well as the perceptions we have about ourselves and others. And so we're trying to change the way people address systemic oppression and inequities. And for us, we do that with design, because we have to move from awareness to action. Rosanna Rosman, which is a part of AIGA, she said that design is not about making things look good, but making things work. But we have to understand that we need to change how we define design, because many times when we talk about design, we talk about it as if it's what we physically can see and touch. But even IBM in the 1960s said that design is the intention behind an outcome. We've expanded that definition at Creative Reaction Lab to say that design is the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome, because good intentions are not enough. We have to hold ourselves accountable to the impact that we're having in our lives and other lives in our communities. But understand that human-centered approaches are not enough, because unfortunately, a lot of human-centered efforts look at community members as users. A lot of human-centered approaches look at community members as beneficiaries, look at community members as research subjects, opposed to being co-designers and co-creators. And when we do this work, we need to understand that even when we are striving for change in our community, we can't just strive for equality, because equality is sameness. We need to strive for equity, which is really around fairness for each person. This image here is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. If you've ever seen an image around equality and equity, most of the time it's the one with the children in front of the fence. We've since switched over to this imagery because it brings in different ability status, it brings in different gender identity, and it really shows the reality that with equality is giving people equal access, but equity is giving people equal outcomes. And that's something we really need to reflect on, because we shouldn't be, again, striving towards human-centered work. We should be striving towards equity-centered work. And at my organization, Creative Reaction Lab, we created a new form of creative problem solving called equity-centered community design that builds upon human-centered design and design thinking methodologies, but honestly challenges it in many ways as well. Understanding that this work shouldn't be done by consultants or people just coming in, helping a community and then leave. How do you invite diverse co-creators where they have the same power as you? Even, I would argue, with community members or living experts should potentially have more, since they are the ones that have to live with the outcomes. How empathy is not enough, and we need to understand that to really become empathetic, we first have to build our own humility. That means having conversations with ourselves, yes, that's okay. And thinking about, what are my privileges? What are my biases? Thinking about, how am I honestly upholding colonization mindsets, upholding white supremacy mindset, upholding able-bodiedness. There's so much that we uphold when we don't actually challenge what the status quo was when we were taught it. Understanding that when we are testing a community, it's testing and learning, and that through all this, equity mindset should be embedded within it. And that it shouldn't just be, hey, fill out this survey, thank you so much for your time. But really thinking about, if we are actually going to do a project in the community, is it a perpetual project? If not, what's the exit strategy so something that was created to help doesn't ultimately lead to more harm and more trauma? And embedded in all steps of this process, really acknowledging that history and healing and power dynamics is a part of all of it. Because there's a reason why Creative Reaction Lab is Creative Reaction Lab instead of Creative Action Lab, even though we get called that, that's not our name. Okay? Reaction was intentionally selected because we are always reacting to our history. That is not something that we could take away because we want to pretend it doesn't exist when we're planning a project. History is always showing up. How has the community been impacted by similar efforts in the past? What are the different experiences people have had in their life through their generations that will impact how they show up as diverse co-creators? And understand that power dynamics comes in every space. I'm a mom. I'm a wife. I know power dynamics are always there because I am always in power, even though my husband likes to argue differently. But it is something that if you are in the front of the room, if you're holding the mic, if you ultimately get to make a decision on what color something is, there's some power coming into play. But we need to understand that we're not just working for process adoption, but a mindset shift. We're not asking you to look at this as a checklist. We're not asking you to pull out those Sharpies and those Post-it notes and say, hey, I've done equity-centered community design. No, thank you. What we're asking you to do is really think about how is my mindset being shifted over time? What am I unlearning? And how am I continually progressing in my journey? And in recognizing whenever the end of day comes for you, because everyone will have an end of day, I will leave one day that I will still have so much more that I could be learning. But in that, we want you to understand that you play an active role in being a redesigner for justice. And for us, a redesigner for justice is someone that really is kind of balancing this dynamic and duality of being an equity designer and a design ally. An equity designer is someone that's puts people in equity first, that's embedded in the community they're working to change because that means they're affected by the outcomes. They're constantly iterating, making, and improving on intervention. They're building upon existing resources as opposed to actually erasing what the community may already be doing. And they have lived experience with the inequity. Now, sometimes we get pushback on this because many people, rightly so, say, why do the people that are historically oppressed have to do the work that the oppressors created? For us, we flip it to more asset language and thinking about the fact that people that are in the community that have lived experience with the issue are many times closest to the approaches to address them, opposed to just looking at it as like a recipient type framework. Here's an example of some of the equity designers we've been working with in our community. And these are young people because we believe youth are the ones that actually will be able to get the job done. But we also understand that allyship is important as well. And so we need to understand spaces in which we can be a design ally. Design allies have similar charges as equity designers, but you're embedded in the community, possibly indirectly. But the most important thing is that you leverage your power and access on behalf of the equity designers. Here's an example of equity designers and design allies working together to think about how do we address the impact that limited public transportation access have on life expectancy of a Black community in the St. Louis region. An important thing to remember is that you can be an equity designer in one context and a design ally in another. So for example, I could be an equity designer for Black women, but I cannot be an equity designer for the LGBTQIA+ community. I can be a design ally though, and really understanding when I should be in the center doing the work and when I should be leveraging my power to help others to do the work in their own communities. And understanding that we need both for equitable outcomes, not one or the other. And that the teams and communities in which you work with should consist of both. Understand that the work that you're doing is not around trying to get a one-size-fits-all solution because that does not exist, but understanding that we need ongoing change and drops in a bucket that ultimately are approaches or interventions, and knowing that it starts with you. So a few tips to help you on your Redesigners for Justice journey. Understand your power to design perspectives and outcome. Appreciate and amplify living expertise equally, if not more so than professional expertise. Just because you have letters behind your name doesn't mean that you know more than me when it comes to certain things. I have lived this reality, so I can tell you what it looks like actually in the community versus what it looks like in a paper. Don't design in ivory towers, but live and immerse yourself on the ground. And one thing I want to note with that is that your computer is an ivory tower. Sometimes step away from that. Question your proximity to power and understand or ask yourself the question, should you step in, which is ableist language, not a huge fan of that, or should I center others? Value the act of building trust and remove agendas. Many people always ask, where do I start? Well, first you need to actually build trust within your own community. And that takes time. And when you have an agenda, most of the time is something that you remove away from it. And then that's when you're having more transactional relationships opposed to actual organic and authentic relationships that would create better outcomes. Really understand that when people from historically underinvested communities speak, listen before questioning. And honestly, sometimes I would ask you not to even question. Acknowledge that you're on a journey and learning while doing, and also so is everyone else. Start and follow through. 2014, I gave myself one New Year's resolution, follow through. That's been the exact same resolution I've had every single year. And it has really helped me understand that awareness or coming up with an idea, that makes you look great. That makes you feel good. That's your ego talking. But actually doing and failing and honestly getting those bumps and scrapes along the process, that is the actual impact. That is the actual development. That is the actual work. Isabel, one of my team members, she was not a team member when she said this quote though, but we've since hired her because that's what you do, said this great quote a few years ago that said that the notion that works only calls upon our professional selves and not our personal selves is a problematic one. When you're doing your work, whether it's with an institution or whether it's at home or in your community, think about how am I really thinking about my identity, my relationship to power? How am I building my humility and how is that showing up in my space and the spaces in which I'm working? And so a few things going forward. Visit creativereactionlab.com. Subscribe to our newsletter to get tips. Attend one of our immersives to really build your own consciousness. Download our field guide. We actually open sourced our field guide for everyone to have around the world because we recognize that this work can't be done by one institution. It can't be done by one person. It has to be done collectively to really design a world that works for all of us. So the last question I will ask you to reflect on yourself is, what's your personal purpose? And if you go to creativereactionlab.com, you can download this image if you want. Again, it's available for free on our approach page, or you can just write it on a sheet of paper. Give yourself an equity pledge and think about what you would do to make your community better. And then create action plan around that. What's my short-term goals for the next week around this? For the next month, for the next 3 months, the next 6 months? And understand that it's a process. My purpose is to make the United States better by providing training, community support, and access for historically underinvested populations to design better health outcomes and improve quality of life for their cultures. I'm doing that through my brother's foundation, through Creative Reaction Lab, through personal projects, and honestly through lack of sleep, if you want me to be honest. But this is what I'm driving towards. This is not something that will happen tomorrow, but it's my North Star. It's why I do what I do. And so I encourage you to think about, why do you do what you do? So feel free to reach out to me if you want to talk, if you have any questions. And I am looking forward to really working with you in the community and being redesigners for justice to really design an equitable community for us all.
Thank you, Antionette. That was absolutely phenomenal. Just amazing. Thank you. And you can find Creative Reaction Lab's Equity Pledge along with other resources linked in the description of Antoinette's talk on behance.net/99U. Be sure to check those out. Now for our final talk of the day. As the host of the podcast Death, Sex, and Money from WNYC Studios, she is no stranger to talking about hard things. Speaking to us in a pre-recorded talk from Wyoming, please welcome Anna Sale.
Hi, I'm Anna Sale. And first, I want to thank you for choosing to watch a talk right now called Let's Talk About Hard Things, because there are plenty of hard things right now. As I speak to you, we're a few months into a global pandemic. Nothing is normal right now. I'm in my in-laws' bedroom. This is where I'm speaking to you from. There's also loss all around, and it's not clear when we're going to be back to anything like stable ground. But this talk is about how it's times like these, whether you're talking about collective suffering or individual pain, now is the time to sort of lean in and talk about hard things with one another. Because when you do that, you are creating something. It's a creative process. Something is there afterwards that didn't exist before, and that's connection. It doesn't make hard things necessarily less hard, but it does mean you don't have to face them in isolation. I do this for a living. I host a podcast called Death, Sex, and Money. And for 6 years, the team and I have tried to really structure conversations with famous people, people who aren't famous, around these hard things in life, with the intention of drawing it out so you feel less alone when you're going through that kind of stuff. And for the last few years, I've been working on a book about how we do that, because I've been really struck by the willingness of people to come to our show and talk about very tender, personal things that you otherwise avoid in polite company. Why do they do that? And I've thought about our process, and I've also talked to a lot of people who've gone through hard things in their lives to get a sense of what kinds of conversations were helpful to them and how those conversations unfolded. I came to this work through my own moment of really hard stuff. This is a picture of me when I was in what I think of as my late 20s and early 30s malaise. I'm standing here in New York City in 2010. At the time, my first marriage was ending, and I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what I was going to do next. I didn't know whether I was going to stay in New York, what kind of work I wanted to do, how I was going to support myself as an unmarried woman again. I remember feeling also so tired of spending a lot of time trying to just hold things together, to make the hard things not break apart what was breaking apart. And I was exhausted. And I also felt really lonely. But that's the time in my life when I realized that the answers aren't somewhere else. I am a journalist. My training is if you make enough phone calls, if you look at enough documents, if you try hard enough, you can figure out some really key, important answers. This is not that. This work is relational. You have to go at the hard things with people in your life to come out of that isolation. And I learned that when I started dating my now husband, Arthur. I sort of overcorrected, and where I was trying to sort of smooth over everything rough at the end of my first marriage, with Arthur, I was just letting my angst flag fly free. And I just let him know everything that I was worried about, the questions I had about whether we made sense. We were long distance. I didn't know what he wanted. He didn't know what he wanted. He didn't know what I wanted. And we talked about it all the time. I talked to him a few years into our relationship about that early period of our relationship, and here's how he described it.
Do you remember the time that, I think it was like one of the first times you talked a lot about fears, and I was like bike shopping in Fort Collins. I remember standing in this bike shop, like telling the salesperson to wait a minute while I tried my first effort at talking you down off the ledge of not wanting to hang out with me anymore.
I can remember I was in Manhattan and I was on my cell phone walking around near 14th Street, and I remember what you said to me was like, look, all you have to decide is if you want to hang out with me right now. If you decide in 6 months from now you don't want to hang out with me, that's okay.
That was my refrain for the better part of that year. And the next year and the year after that.
We learned to talk about hard things together. When I say hard things, like there's a lot of hard things in life, but I think of them in 5 big categories. There's death, the fact that we're all going to die, and also that there are stakes to the decisions we make and the mistakes we make. Sex, who we choose to be with, the kind of family we want to make. Money, how we survive, how we deal with our ambition, our status. Also family, our relationship to the people we came from, our families of origin, and how that develops and changes as we grow up. And identity is also a hard thing to talk about. And I mean how we are identified by others and also how we identify. And I want to pause here and just say, like, these things have always been hard. But I would argue that the onus is more on us as individuals to skillfully navigate this stuff in conversation with the people in our lives. Now, the onus is on us now in a way that it hasn't been in previous generations. I think about rituals and institutions that used to be sort of stand-ins for dealing with this hard stuff together. Like when I was growing up, when someone died in the community, my mom would take a covered dish over to someone's front door, and that was a way of saying, I see you're in pain, I want to help you, I'm here. I can't do that with a lot of people I love in my life. I have to sit and figure out what is the way to respond to this social media post now that I know that this person I went to high school with is gone. I have to figure out what's the phone conversation I'm going to have to reach out. Or when someone is dying, what do I want to say to them? The other thing that's really different now, like family. As we've shed conventions and become more free in what family can look like and the rules we want to make for our own families, this DIY freedom also has meant that a lot of the onus is on us to figure out how to make those decisions on a one-by-one basis. And if you didn't feel this before COVID-19, you've certainly felt it in the last few months. I mean, if you've had a colleague who's lost a job, you couldn't just take them to a bar with all your coworkers afterwards and celebrate them and sort of talk indirectly about the pain, but support them. You've had to figure out how to call them, the email to write, what to say. And if you're single right now and dating, if you had a good FaceTime date and then a good second FaceTime date, like you haven't had touch as a way to also communicate how you feel about this new person. You've only had words. And that's hard. But talking about hard things can be easier, I think, when you acknowledge that hard things are hard for a reason. There are hard truths about each of these 5 things that if you say, I can't talk my way around this or fix this, that it makes the conversation feel a little bit more possible. For example, with death, for someone who's died, for someone who's grieving, you can't make that go away. That loss is there. You can't make them feel better. You can just accompany them in that grief. With sex, the hard truth is, no matter how well you talk about consent or what you want and try to draw out what the other person wants, there's this, what you're doing is trying to figure out if you can come to an agreement. So there's always the risk that someone is going to be rejected and someone has to do the rejecting, that there's going to be pain there. You can't talk your way around that. With money, a really key fact that we like to ignore is people have different amounts of money. That's a result of luck and history and also effort. But when we talk about money together, we sort of go into this code of aspiration that if you work really hard enough, you can make it and everybody can make it. That's not true. And that's not how we should talk about money. And that's not how you need to talk about money. With family, a really key hard truth that I think that we forget about is part of growing up is separating from your family of origin. That's what growing up means. So when you feel a sense of alienation from these people you come from your family of origin, it's normal. It's not something that needs to be fixed with words. It's something that comes with growing up. And finally, identity. The hard truth here is that the way we are identified and the way we identify fundamentally shift the way we move through the world. My ability to understand what somebody else's experience is, who is identified or identifies very differently than me, is limited. I can't empathize with them. I'm not going to be able to understand. So what I need to do is hear, listen to that perspective, and learn and learn to incorporate it into my worldview. I thought about this a lot. We did an episode about race and friendship on Death, Sex, and Money, and we asked people to tell us stories about their friendships and when race had kind of come up in a flashpoint. And what was most interesting to me was, in particular in interracial friendships between white people and people of color, we heard a lot about how race was really clearly a factor in tensions that had come up, but it was really hard to talk directly about what was happening. I want to play you a clip from a woman named Antionette who told us a story about a white woman that she worked with who was a work friend. They worked together, they got along, and then they had one of those work spats where it was a Sunday, they had a meeting. The white woman said, I can't make the meeting, let's reschedule. And Antionette said, don't worry about it, let's just cancel the meeting. And then the white woman starts calling her on her cell phone. And it's clear that the white woman is thinking, oh my gosh, Antoinette's mad at me, I want to solve this. Antoinette's thinking, it's a Sunday, I'm watching my kid. I also have a leak in my ceiling. I don't want to answer this phone call right now and have this conversation about her feelings. This is how she talked about it.
For me, it's kind of like when the rubber hits the road sometimes in these situations. The hierarchy of feelings come out.
Tell me more about the hierarchy of feelings. That's a really useful concept, I think.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think it's true that there is a hierarchy of who gets to feel what and when. And I don't think that my feelings are valued or acknowledged in the same level in which a white woman's feelings are acknowledged or valued.
So I asked Antionette, what do you think would happen if you said to this friend, like, let's talk about that day and what happened. I want to tell you how it made me feel. And she said, actually, I'm going to have coffee with her after I've been thinking about it and I want to talk to her about it. And then I said, do you think you're going to bring up race? And she said, I don't think I can lead with that. I'm going to see if it's okay to bring it in. And I'm bothered by the fact that I have to lead with her feelings and see if it's okay instead of my own. I think that's important to think about when you're thinking about a hard thing, a hard conversation that you feel like you need to have or you want to broach. Think about what's the objective of it, because there's three kind of different kinds and it affects the way that you structure the conversation. The first is like Antionette. You want to express something that you feel like has been festering or a way in which you felt overlooked or unheard. You want to say, like, I need you to hear this. Another kind of hard conversation is you want to understand something. You want to reach out to somebody who, like, there's something you think they might have struggled with. You want to know more. You want to kind of also address some maybe confusion you have or check your assumptions. Just say to them, can you tell me more? The other kind of hard conversation is shorter, but we also tend to avoid it because it feels a little awkward, and that's to like acknowledge when there are hard things. That's the conversation where you need to say to your friend, I'm having a hard time in my relationship. I'm having a hard time at work. Or say to somebody in your life, like, are you doing okay? I notice that you're having a hard time. How do you start these conversations? When I think about how I do it at Death, Sex, and Money, it's kind of like two tracks. I want to think about how I want to listen and then how I want to speak up. When you're creating a conversation where you're asking somebody to talk about something hard, where you need their permission and their buy-in, the first step is always to sort of prepare them and to explain why you want to have the conversation. When I'm doing this in the context of the show, when a guest is coming on the show, I say, like, this show is called Death, Sex, and Money. I know that might sound scary. The reason we talk about these things on the show is because we're trying to get at the variations of all the ways people experience hard things. Ask. I use short questions that are specific, that try to get right at what I'm wondering about or feel like I need to talk about. And then once we're in a conversation, it's much more sort of about this hard, tender stuff with someone we know or even people in our own lives. So I use pauses a lot, sometimes to just like let things sink in. Sometimes the person I'm talking to will fill that silence. Sometimes it helps me figure out, oh, what do I want to say to acknowledge what this person is telling me? And that reaction is like, sometimes it's saying like, thank you for sharing this with me. I didn't know this. Or sometimes it's saying like, wow, that's really surprising. That's not how I would have reacted at all. And having that conversation. And then when you're ending that conversation where you've asked someone to talk about something sensitive, I always like to thank them and just say like, thanks for talking about this with me, because it is a real privilege. When you're having a conversation where it's more up to you to bring up, you have something to say that you think is going to be a little hard for somebody to hear, that preparation work is similar. It's sort of, you want to announce that you're going to have a conversation that's a little bit outside the norm. I need to talk to you about something that's been really bothering me. I need to talk to you about something that I feel kind of sad about. And I just want to tell you, just kind of lay that ground for a little bit more openness and listening. I had a therapist tell me once, you can talk about anything if you just think about how you're going to start talking about it, because you have to get around those blocks of defensiveness or sort of attempt to try to get to that place where someone can really hear you. And then you want to sort of think about, what are they going to be thinking when I'm coming at them with this, something that maybe they weren't expecting, and say, like, just kind of acknowledge what their experience might be. So you're sort of reflecting back, and then you're redirecting it back to what you want to say. I know this might be uncomfortable for you to hear, but I really need you to hear this. And then once you express yourself, listen back to what they have to say. And pause, take your time, and then end the conversation if you can. Sometimes it's just like, we can't talk about this anymore, it's too hot. But sometimes it's, oh, I hear you, I see it differently. You don't have to make a resolution for it to be a successful, hard conversation. You're sharing information with one another. I want to end with a piece of tape from the actor Holland Taylor that gets at that like, hard conversations do not fix what is hard in life. I went to her apartment several years ago and was talking to her about the death of her mother. And she described what it was like to be beside her mother as she took her last breaths. And this is what she said.
And all I can say about death that I felt then and now, what I learned from it is absolutely nothing. It's like looking at, I don't know, a volcano or tidal wave, the sky at night. It's incomprehensible experience. Just to be with someone as they die. Astonishing. I could weep now thinking of it, and yet I couldn't really tell you about it. There's nothing to tell. A person was there, a person went away. And left themselves behind, too. It's just very strange. Very, very strange. And I got no philosophy from it at all.
I really love how she says that, because she's saying, this was a really hard thing. I'm going to describe it to you. I can't give you any answers. I can't tell you what it meant. I can't comfort you as I'm telling you, but I'm going to describe that I went through this hard thing, and it was bigger than me. That's what you do when you talk with somebody about a hard thing. You are saying, let's witness this together, this thing that we have to maneuver around together and don't have the answers for. And you're creating something when you do that. Again, you're moving out of isolation. You're moving out of stigma, and you're creating community. And that's really, really important. So let's do it together. Thank you.
So Anna's forthcoming book, called Let's Talk About Hard Things, will be published in spring of 2021. And that closes out our live stream for this year's virtual conference. Now, opening right now on behance.net/99U is our next limited edition giveaway. You'll have a chance to design your own laser engraved colored pencil set with Adobe Capture and Make Lab. Be sure to check it out. And a reminder, prints of the creative specimens, that beautiful menagerie of creatures from our friends at Paper Chase Press, they're still available. All of the profits going to Feeding America and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. A big, big, big thank you to all of this year's speakers, our team members and partners who worked so hard to make our first ever virtual 99U happen. In particular, the 99U team, the Behance team, preview events and films, regular events, Adobe Design and Adobe Live, and so many more. And a particular shout out to the force behind 99U, my colleague, Andrea Rosen. I am lucky I get to work with her. Andrea, fantastic, fantastic work as always. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Take care of your creative self, and we will see you again soon.